Well, hi, community. We're so glad you would join us for the first session of our 2-week series on emotional health, from emotional exhaustion to well-being workshop. I'm here today with Laura Porter. And Laura Porter is a counselor over at Restore Hope KC. We've gotten connected with her through Christ Prep Academy, where she is a teacher, and she's also a teacher at Maranatha. And she attends Foundry Church just down the street. She's married to Dave, and they have 5 kids. And we have just loved getting to know her. And through connections together, we found out that she did a seminar like this for Christ Prep, and we wanted to see if she could bless us with some of her wealth and knowledge, because we know this last year has been hard. And so today what we're going to do is just spend the next little bit of time asking some questions and picking Laura's brain and learning about how can we cope and how can we go forward and build some really good healthy practices as we move forward in the season of COVID and all the different things compounding on the season of life. So thank you so much, Laura, for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.
Yeah. Well, our first question really is, so why is emotional health really so important for us to address?
I think that's kind of like 2 questions in a way. So one question is, why address it in the church at all? And I think that it's really important that we view ourselves as whole people, and that we're kind of in this human state for a while, right? God put us in this human state for 80 or 90 years or however long he keeps us here on earth. And as we're in this human state, we have a full range of emotions, and we have our physical health and we have our spiritual health, and they all affect each other. And so I think that it's really important as a church that we don't ignore emotional health. And then the second part, I guess, is why address this now? And, we've just have and are still in this craziness of COVID. It's been a really difficult year for us as a nation. I think the church has had its own unique struggles with COVID and trying to manage how do we do church in the season of COVID? How do we do family in COVID? And I think what we've noticed is that there is no singular experience, that everybody's is a little bit different. And so we have to ask each other, like, how are you doing? What can I do to help you? What are your specific needs? And we have to really be willing to reach out to each other. But as we do that, even though our experiences are different, we do notice that there are some common things that we experience. And when we begin to share those common experiences, then that helps normalize what we're going through. And it makes us feel not so different, not so unusual, maybe not so, crazy, maybe. Sometimes we feel a little bit that way right now. And so being able to talk about it and share about it's really important.
Yeah, I totally agree with it. I think that is so important, because I think the times that I've been able to share, you find that connection and you feel that like, oh, I'm not alone in some of this.
Right.
Now, we've talked about different trends. So we started this in March last year. I know for some places it was January, February, but for Kansas City, it's been March. What kind of trends have you been seeing just with the emotional health through this past year? I mean, to me, I kind of clustered in groups. It was like March to May, there was kind of a cluster of what people were thinking and feeling. And then we went into summer, maybe even through the fall, and we thought things weren't there. And it seems like we're kind of in a new season again. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but it just seems like we're in this new season of where people are. So can you talk about some of those trends you've seen?
Right. I have definitely noticed that as well. And I think in the beginning, we've never done anything like this before. It's all new to us and how to live life like this. And so they're using a term to describe it a lot. It's called acute anticipatory anxiety. And we've all been experiencing, at least early in the pandemic, acute anticipatory anxiety. We're having news conferences every day, for the nation, telling us what to expect, and this is what we're going to do, and people are tuned in and they're afraid. And so there was really a high level of anxiety, lots of really even panic, fear, feelings of loss of control, and just helplessness. Definitely saw with the shelter in place, saw additional family conflict. People not being able to leave their homes. They're being, kind of in confined areas with people for long periods of time. There was some conflict between friends and family over differences on how they were going to handle the shelter in place, and if they were going to see each other, and how they were going to celebrate birthdays, and then we get into holidays and things like that, which added some additional family conflict. We saw additional marriage conflict, where couples are having to work really closely together to make really hard decisions. And I think maybe the biggest thing is the grief, because has been so much loss over the last year. And that loss for some people has been a very tangible bereavement. They've lost someone they loved. For many of us, it has been more of a disenfranchised grief, where we're grieving something that's hard to explain. And not everybody recognizes it. And it becomes disenfranchised when people don't recognize your grief, or the society doesn't validate that for you. And so you kind of get lost and feel alone in it. And that grief is like, loss of graduation was a big one at my house. Loss of freedom, loss of family connection, loss of connection with friends in general, and that isolation. And just kind of loss of support system or lack of support system, loss of connection with our church body, those kinds of things. There's a grief that's connected to that, and it's hard for people to put their finger on. And then there's kind of a collective grief that we experienced as a nation, which is very unusual. And people in some older generations, my parents' generation, and older, understood the grief that we experienced during wartime. Where they would share about the number of casualties or losses every single day. And for the longest time, and even really still now, we're having death tolls posted every day. And there's a collective grief that we have as a nation that's also a little bit, there's no real ritual or way to honor that grief that we're experiencing. And so that becomes disenfranchised. It's hard to manage. Kind of mid-pandemic, there was more of a sense of hopelessness and sadness, and like, I thought this would be over by now. I thought I could hope in something like vacation, and that didn't happen. Increase in conflict still. Basically, what we might call that is pandemic fatigue. And so then there's choices that people are making to kind of relieve that fatigue. Maybe they just decided I'm going to go do this anyway, and then they have conflict with their family. And also I noticed just an increase in anger. With the increase in fatigue has come an increase in anger. And it's projected often at other people, leadership or friends who are doing things differently, or family who don't understand, and no place for that anger really to be maybe effectively diffused or appropriately managed. And so it's just kind of this simmering thing that happens. And I've also noticed during that phase, just a lot of emotional distancing then. People kind of checking out from relationships, checking out from life. It just has gotten hard when there's conflict with family and friends. Right now, I feel like what I'm seeing is true. It's just a kind of a renewed sense of hope. It's a very cautious hope. But there is kind of that sense of maybe I can do this in the future. Maybe I can see my grandmother soon. Maybe I can go on vacation this summer. And that renewed sense of hope, I think, is bringing about a little bit more positivity. So those are kind of the trends I'm seeing, both in my practice and just kind of in life in general.
That's really helpful. I love the loss, naming that as a loss, because I think sometimes we don't name it of what it is, and the anger that's behind that was really interesting, because I think you're right, that anger, you just kind of have that underneath and simmers. And I do hope it's hope. That's good to hear, that you see a renewed sense of a cautious hope. Well, I know within this last year, we've also had a lot of things happening. And so I was kind of wondering about this compounding effect. So we had first COVID, and then we had a very contentious election. Mm-hmm. We dealt with racial tensions. Then you add in schools and not getting to go, or that, and those family situations and things like that. That's a lot of things that we have compounded in a short amount of time. Yeah. And I have to think there's some sort of trigger or something that's all at work and being at play in some of this too for emotional exhaustion. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, I think, and some of it too is just the longevity of it. COVID has gone on so long, and so then the other stuff that's added in that we might normally handle in a more resilient way, we don't always have the resources to be able to do that, and our resilience has worn down a little bit. We're noticing really that the fatigue again, where people are maybe not coping as well, might have been able to deal with a contentious election. We've had The one before this one was a contentious election, and we've handled it a little bit differently. I think people are managing in different ways. So some people are coping really, really well, and some people not maybe coping as well, and maybe acting on some behaviors that are maybe not as healthy, like emotional eating or some numbing behaviors like lots of Netflix or online shopping or something like that. Seeing some of that, but. I wouldn't want to put anybody in a box and say nobody's coping well, because I don't think that's true either. But it definitely has added to the pain and stress of the time.
It's interesting. Well, as we look at this, I'm a big believer that our emotional health can't be separated from our spiritual life, that they really are deeply interconnected. And you talked a little bit about it, but can you expand that a little further of why is it so important for us to understand our emotional health in order to really grow and thrive in our spiritual lives?
Sure. Really, for those of us who have faith, God is our anchor. And so when we reach out and use God as our anchor point in managing all kinds of things that we deal with, but it always is going to affect our emotional health with that, and allowing him to be our anchor and to be our peace and to be our comforter and to be our counselor, and all those words that the Bible uses that describe God that way. Bring about an additional emotional health, I think, for us. And in the Bible, in Philippians 4:8, we're encouraged to fix our thoughts on whatever's true and whatever's honorable and whatever's right, pure, lovely, admirable. I think those are anchor points for us, because our thoughts are so very, very powerful. And so when we are focused on our relationship with God, when we are focused on God being our comforter and our peace, when we are focused on the true things, the right things, the admirable things, those direct our thoughts, and those thoughts direct our feelings. And so it's all interconnected. I don't think we can separate any of it. There is, we have focused a lot, I think, in the past on a term called post-traumatic stress. And there is also something called post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth means when we have come through a crisis, that a lot of people grow instead of experience all kinds of dysfunctional things. A lot of people will grow during that time. And so I think when God is our anchor, that we have this opportunity for growth during this time. And so, that additional spiritual focus and keeping that in mind can help us to grow during this time instead of be maybe transformed in a negative way by it.
I don't know if you've read the Chronicles of Narnia series, but the third book, the Eustace, when he's the dragon and Aslan's peeling off those scales, I always use that as a kind of a metaphor of how you're in painful things. It's painful, but through you refine and you really grow. That we like bad situations, but man, it's amazing to see how God can transform us through them.
Right. But we really have to allow God to transform us during those times, because we have the option to become bitter and angry and stay in an ugly place, and those scars can be something that affects us negatively, or we can grow and we can be transformed by Christ during those times, and that is a choice sometimes that we make, and just where we direct our focus.
Well, you mentioned a little bit about coping. As you look at people with coping, sometimes people do cope in good ways, but sometimes they don't. What are you seeing, or ways that people really are coping, and how do we help them make better healthy choices? Why do you think people don't choose good coping mechanisms and healthy ways to move through this?
I think people don't choose good coping mechanisms because they've not been taught how to do that. Our go-to is not always the healthy choice. Our go-to is whatever feels right in the moment sometimes, and we tend to lean towards things maybe that aren't as healthy for us. That people are coping in good and bad ways. So I'm going to share with you some ways that people are coping in an unhealthy way, but then I also want to tell you what some of the healthy things people are doing, because I think some of them are really creative, and I've seen a lot of good things come through this too. The unhealthy things that I see people doing, I've kind of already mentioned, sort of like the overeating or the stress eating, comfort eating. And we've all joked about how much we've gained during quarantine. Well, we're not in quarantine anymore, and we're still gaining weight. So maybe I shouldn't say we, personally, and others that I've talked to. So we need to stop like comfort eating The numbing behaviors, sometimes we think about that as self-care. We think, oh, I'm just going to watch this movie and or I'm just going to sit down today with my Netflix and I'm just going to relax. That's actually not self-care. That's numbing. And it doesn't lead you to a good place. And actually, the longer you spend watching Netflix or scrolling Facebook or something like that, often the more sad you feel. And so those are just behaviors that they're escapist kinds of behaviors. And I mentioned social media already. Social media has a tendency to go so negative so quickly right now. And so that's also maybe an unhealthy form of coping. And people are using that to vent, and I don't think that that's productive. So probably also an unhealthy means. Isolation has been kind of, just see this withdrawal that people are having from kind of social opportunities, even safe social opportunities. So I think some people have gotten to a point where they've had enough conflict where they're like, I just don't even want to talk to people right now. And so there's this intentional isolation, not just the isolation that comes from COVID. We're seeing additional substance use as well. Extra alcohol use, or people using substances in other ways that aren't healthy. Some healthy things I've seen people do, though. My yard personally has never looked as good as it did last spring, and so I noticed all my neighbors were doing the same thing. We didn't have a lot of choices about places to go. There was nothing to do, and so everybody was out in the yard. And so then there was an additional meeting of neighbors across fences, which was a safe way to have community. Discovering new hobbies, lots of cooking, which cooking leads to eating, but cooking, or discovering a hobby that they hadn't done for a long time, painting or something like that, and people picking up or discovering new hobbies, attending to some needs in your household, renovations and things. I have a friend who has completely rehabbed. She decided to start rehabbing old campers, which is a crazy creative way to just use all that time to invest in something fun. I don't know if you've noticed that bicycles are really difficult to get a hold of because people were outside until just recently when the weather has gotten worse, and just being more active outside, biking and walking and things like that. And developing things like social pods or book clubs that they can do online and things like that. There's been a lot of creative coping too. So I don't want to just focus on the negative, because I think there's been so many good things that people are doing too.
That's great. I know with the unhealthy, when you're thinking that, I was thinking about, I've gained some weight too during COVID, and I'm back doing Weight Watchers and really intentionally of doing it. But I've had so many people say, oh, it's no big deal. And we justify it so often, isn't it? When it comes to unhealthy things, that we could just wave it off like it's not a big deal. So you have to really be intentional to say, no, it really is a big deal.
It is. And those unhealthy physical things like eating too much or not exercising affect you emotionally at some point too, and it just becomes kind of this big messy cycle.
Yeah. Well, so we've talked about coping now. So what are some strategies? So we've kind of identified from emotional exhaustion. So now let's move into well-being. So what are some strategies really to help us kind of move through this and to say, okay, here's next steps. Here's things we could practically start doing to move to well-being.
Yeah, well, there's two things I really want to focus on. One of which, we can all do. If you think about, we can actually do all of them, but if you think about the things that we worry about, all of the what ifs in this situation, in life in general, we could call that kind of our circle of concern. And there are many, many things in our circle of the concern, but very few things do we actually have control of. And so we kind of need to think about it maybe in two different sets. We have kind of this large circle of concern, and we have a smaller circle of control that's within that. So maybe my large circle of concern is, what if this person is president? What if, COVID goes on another year? What if they couldn't find a vaccination? What if the vaccinations don't work? What if the vaccinations are dangerous? What if someone I love gets sick? And we can just go on and on and on and on with those things. We have no control over them. But our circle of control for us is I can wear a mask. I can wash my hands. I can find, people to be in community with in ways that I feel safe. I can write letters and encourage people. I can find, constructive ways to serve other people. I can work on my spiritual health and my spiritual walk. I can, learn something new during this time. And when we start focusing more on the I cans in that circle of control, as opposed to the what ifs, then we're going to have a little bit better balance. Because we kind of take off on the what ifs and we get stuck there. So it's not like they don't exist anymore, but when you find yourself kind of free floating in all of the what ifs, go back to your circle of control. What do I have control over? And then really focus on those things. And that in and of itself has been a really important strategy for a lot of people during this time. The other things are to practice self-care. And self-care really comes in 3 forms: body, mind, and soul. And so some examples for self-care for your body is to exercise 20 to 30 minutes a day. We all need that for our physical health. We need it for our emotional health. Just that boost of endorphins really helps with your mood. But also we just need physical care of our bodies. We need to eat well and think about good nutrition. During this time, all times, really. It's part of taking care of and being a steward of the body that God gave us. Drinking water and just participating in healthy activities. In practicing self-care with your mind, to keep your brain engaged. Learn something new, try a different activity, read books. I've noticed in the digital age, we read less and our attention span has diminished in written material. And so let's try to, expand it again and work backwards against that and learn to be content with focusing on the written word. Limit our news and limit our social media. A lot of people have had to do that. The news has gotten very frightening. Social media is frightening and negative. And so, if you must engage in these things to stay informed or to stay what you feel like is connected, then limit it so that it's also not just unlimited access to your heart with this information.
When you say limit, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. What would you recommend, like 20 minutes at a time, like set a timer? Or
I would set a timer. And I think it's a little bit different for everybody. I've had clients where I'm like, limit yourself of 10 minutes of news a day and find the station that's the least inflammatory for you. So if you have one that just gets you going, like don't do that one. Limit one that you feel like is just concise, that just gives facts, that you feel like you can trust. I think that's a big thing right now. And then limit it to short periods because really the news is just a replaying of the same information over and over and over. And we can't escape it when we just keep exposing our brains to that. In terms of social media, we probably need to be limiting that anyway because that tends to get out of control for us. But, if you must check Facebook or Instagram or whatever, limit yourself to a time, 15, 20 minutes once a day. And just try to kind of contain that a little bit. And then also in terms of engaging your mind and self-care for your mind, I think journaling is so important and helpful during this time and, really any time. But to start your journaling with a gratitude list because gratitude leads to optimism and that leads to hope. And we need that right now. And so, our tendency is to go, if our journaling is a spiritual prayer time, is to say, dear God, everything is terrible. And we start listing out all those things. But if we start with things that we can be grateful for, that we have gratitude for, it really changes how we engage the world. It changes how we engage God and just interact in those ways in our relationships. And so we need more optimism and hopefulness in that. And then self-care for the soul, spending time developing your spiritual walk with God. And I kind of talked about using scripture as anchor points. And I have recommended some people put scriptures in different places, hopeful scriptures, scriptures of truth in places where they will see them often. So on your mirror, by your nightstand, by the kitchen sink, where you have these little anchors located all over the house. Now we're out and about more. Do you need it in your car? Do you need it on your desk at work? And those anchors in spiritual truth. We always need them, but I would almost say we've never needed them more desperately than we do right now. And so put them in front of you all the time. Worship is huge for my soul. And I think for a lot of people, just it's a different way of being in the presence of God and kind of takes down all of those walls and defenses and just speaks to a different place of our heart. And that's so good for the soul. Serving others. like loving your neighbor is good soul care. Because we have found that God has created us to be people of community. And so when we love our neighbors well, it feeds our soul too. It's the economy of God. It's not the economy of man that it works out that way. But serving other people and finding really constructive ways and helpful ways to think outside of ourselves and to love our neighbors well is good soul care. Finding safe ways to connect with others during this time where we're really tempted to disengage and to pull back, to resist that urge and to connect with other people. And we have to be kind of creative with some of that, but we live in a world where the technology is such that we can do that if we're willing to. And maybe even get rid of technology and go back to an old-fashioned way of writing notes and letter writing and things like that. I think even within our household, we can do that. Sometimes, I've recommended to couples, who have been in quarantine together. They've been in the house, they never leave, and so they quit talking to each other because they already know each other's day and each other's business, and there's nothing left to say. And so sometimes I recommend they play kind of a mailbox game where they take a notebook and write a note, to their partner. Maybe it's, I'm just so thankful for this in you, that I see this way that you are with the kids, or how you love me, and tuck it underneath their pillow. And then they can exchange this notebook back and forth. This is a way of connection in a deeper level, and we need to find more of those. And then just laugh. Laughing more, that's good. I think that's good for body, mind, and soul, but I put that under soul care. That is one of those emotions that we maybe don't engage in enough. We've gotten very serious right now. And so finding ways to laugh and just enjoy life and to be joyful, whether it's gathering the kids together and watch a funny movie, or just finding some free time that's lighthearted, where you can be playful with your kids or your family or your pets or whatever, but laugh more.
Those are incredible ideas. I love them. And I know that there's a lot of them that some of them I already do, and some I'm like, oh, I'm going to take those and put them in practice. When you're talking about the scripture notes around it, made me think of Deuteronomy, where with the Shema, they say, impress it on your foreheads, put it on doorposts. It's because we need to be constantly reminded and have those visual, tangible reminders all around us. So hope you got some of those ideas and wrote them down and ready to start putting them in practice, because those are some great ideas and things we need. Well, obviously these are great strategies, and we'll be gauging kind of where people are, but for some people, they may be kind of past some of these strategies. So can you talk about, how do you really know, what, I maybe I'm trying some of this, but I still feel stuck, or I still am just not feeling like I can move on? How do you know when probably the next step is maybe to go see a counselor, or to go get some additional help and support? How can you be aware of when those moments happen?
Yeah, I think that you start to notice that your level of functioning perhaps has decreased. Maybe you are struggling to concentrate at work, or to effectively communicate with your coworkers or your family. When anger is spilling out more maybe than anything else, when the sadness prevails and can't be touched by various strategies. Those are times, I think, where it's especially helpful to reach out. I have noticed an uptick in people just in general saying, I need more support people in my life right now, because I have had to pull back, and I haven't had my group of girls to meet with, or whatever that looks like. And they've reached out and done some counseling and things like that. So I think it's important to know yourself and kind of know your capacity for managing that stress. And if you feel like you're not doing well, or doing as well as you could be, it's always a good time to seek out the help of someone else. But particularly for those people who are just, kind of in that place of, I can't get out of this sadness, or this anxiety is keeping me from being as high functioning as I want to, or my relationships are really being affected deeply. I think then it's really time to maybe start reaching out for some additional help.
Laura, I know I didn't ask this ahead of time to you, but talk to me about stigma. I know throughout the last few years, it's gotten a little bit less about getting help, but I still see there's still some that really have the stigma of, I'm too ashamed or embarrassed, or I should be able to do it on my own. Can you talk about, how do we push past that stigma, that it's okay to get help?
Sure. I do think the stigma around emotional and mental health and seeking help for that has gotten so much better in the last 15 or 20 years. And people are talking about it, and sharing about their personal experiences, and it's really a positive thing. I do think one area where I see the stigma maybe the most is within the church, because we have this body, mind, soul connection. But a lot of people really focus on the spiritual health, and they think if their spiritual health was better, then their mental health would naturally improve. And we don't, that's far from true. We see cases even in the Bible when we talk about David, and David is so desperately low and calling out to God and really asking for him to come and be present and to pull him out of his pit. And Job also, and God is near and God is present during all of those things, and yet they are still sad. And that happens sometimes. And sometimes we need a guide to just kind of help us progress through that time and to get to the other side. And so, it really has nothing to do with if you were just a better Christian, then things would look up for you, or things would be better for you. And so we have to release that stigma as well.
That's so good. Well, Laura, this has just been amazing. And I've just gotten a wealth of ideas, and just to be able to concretely talk about what is going on, what you sense and feel, but sometimes you don't know how to articulate, has been helpful for me, and I'm sure for so many people watching. So I want to encourage you and thank you for watching. What we're going to do now, just give you a little bit of an update. So you're in your growth groups right now, or in your small groups, we have some discussion questions for you to follow up with. So we're going to invite you to take the next 15 minutes or longer, however long it takes, to really kind of break down and answer some more of these questions and process all that you have heard today. Then what we're going to encourage you to do for the next week is, if there are specific questions, maybe something going on in your life, I'm really wrestling with how to integrate with my parents right now because we have different philosophies of what does it mean to be safe, or whatever it is that you're struggling with. I want to encourage you to send those to me through email, jessica.s@cccks.org. We'll send you the link. And next week, we're going to have a Zoom. So we'll just be on a Zoom, and we're going to answer some of those specific questions that people are wrestling with. And if you don't get to write those out ahead of time, we will have a place in the chat where you can filter them through me, and then I will moderate them out. So it'll still be anonymous as we do it. So I'm looking forward to that, being able to answer some of these specific questions that people are wrestling and struggling with as we go through this time. So
Me too.
it'll be fun. So, well, I appreciate you guys coming and journeying along. Just the fact that you wanted to take this workshop and the seminar is just such a great step to be aware of. You know what? There's things going on that I want to be proactive. I want to grow and learn and understand and really continue to grow in my emotional and my spiritual health together is an important step. So thank you for taking the time to make this a priority in your growth groups, in your individual groups, and other groups as well. So blessings to you, and we will see you next week.